On September 11, 2001, the world watched in horror as terrorists attacked the United States. The attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon shocked the world. Nearly 3,000 innocent people were killed that day. The attacks were a wake-up call to the threat of global terrorism. They also marked the beginning of a new era in international relations. The attacks were planned and carried out by Al-Qaeda. This terrorist group was led by Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden had declared war on the United States. He opposed the presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia. He also opposed US support for Israel. The 9/11 attacks were a pivotal moment in history. They led to the US invasion of Afghanistan. The US aimed to dismantle Al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban from power. The Taliban had provided safe haven to bin Laden and his followers. The US was determined to hold those responsible accountable and prevent future attacks. The world entered a new era of conflict and uncertainty. The United States responded swiftly and decisively to the 9/11 attacks. President George W. Bush launched Operation Enduring Freedom. This military operation sought to destroy Al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban regime. The Taliban had refused to hand over bin Laden. They harbored the terrorist group within Afghanistan. The US was determined to dismantle the terrorist network. They aimed to prevent future attacks. The US was joined by allies from NATO. Together they launched airstrikes against Taliban and Al-Qaeda targets. US special forces worked with Afghan allies. These included the Northern Alliance. This Afghan group had long opposed the Taliban. The US-led coalition made rapid progress. They quickly toppled the Taliban regime. The Taliban were driven from power by December 2001. Key leaders, including bin Laden, escaped. They fled into the mountainous border regions of Afghanistan and Pakistan. The US and its allies had achieved a significant victory. However, the war was far from over. The removal of the Taliban was just the beginning. A long and difficult struggle lay ahead. Despite their initial defeat, the Taliban were not finished. They regrouped in Pakistan. From there, they launched a relentless insurgency against the US-led forces and the new Afghan government. The Taliban exploited the rugged terrain. They used guerrilla tactics. They were a constant threat. The Taliban's insurgency was fueled by several factors. They gained support from some segments of the Afghan population. This support stemmed from resentment toward the US-led occupation. There were also allegations of civilian casualties caused by US and allied forces. The Taliban exploited these incidents. They used them to bolster their propaganda. The Taliban also benefited from the porous border with Pakistan. They found refuge in the tribal areas. These areas were difficult for the Pakistani military to control. The Taliban were able to recruit, train, and launch attacks from these safe havens. This cross-border sanctuary proved to be a major challenge for the US and its allies. The Taliban's insurgency grew in strength. This prolonged the war. The conflict became increasingly costly. It also took a heavy toll on both Afghan civilians and international forces. The war in Afghanistan was not just a fight against the Taliban. It was also a global war on terror. The US and its allies were determined to dismantle Al-Qaeda. The terrorist group still posed a threat. They were believed to be planning further attacks. The US intelligence community worked tirelessly to track down Al-Qaeda operatives. The US employed a variety of tactics in the war on terror. These included drone strikes, special operations raids, and intelligence gathering. Drone strikes in particular became a controversial aspect of the war. They were effective in killing Al-Qaeda leaders. However, they also resulted in civilian casualties. These civilian casualties fueled anti-American sentiment. The US also worked closely with governments around the world. They shared intelligence. They also cooperated on counter-terrorism efforts. The goal was to disrupt Al-Qaeda's networks. The US aimed to prevent them from carrying out attacks. The war on terror was a global effort. It required cooperation and coordination on an unprecedented scale. Section 5. The killing of bin Laden, a turning point. On May 2, 2011, the world learned that Osama bin Laden had been killed. He was killed in a US special operations raid in Abbottabad, Pakistan. Bin Laden's death was a major victory in the war on terror. It was a significant blow to Al-Qaeda. The news was met with celebrations across the United States. Bin Laden's death was seen by many as a turning point in the war. It raised hopes that the conflict in Afghanistan could finally come to an end. President Barack Obama announced plans to begin withdrawing US troops from Afghanistan. The drawdown was to be gradual. It aimed to hand over security responsibilities to the Afghan government. However, the Taliban remained a potent force. The group continued to carry out attacks. They showed no signs of abandoning their fight. The killing of bin Laden, while a significant victory, did not bring an end to the war. The conflict in Afghanistan was far from over. Section 6. The Doha Agreement, a flawed path to peace. In February 2020, the United States and the Taliban signed a peace agreement in Doha, Qatar. The agreement aimed to end the nearly two-decade-long war in Afghanistan. It called for the withdrawal of all US and NATO troops. In exchange, the Taliban pledged to prevent Afghanistan from being used as a base for terrorist attacks. The Doha Agreement was met with cautious optimism. It was seen as the best hope for peace after years of bloodshed. However, the agreement was also criticized for its flaws. It did not include the Afghan government in the negotiations. The agreement also relied on the Taliban to keep their promises. The Taliban had a long history of broken promises. The Doha Agreement proved to be a fragile peace. The Taliban continued to launch attacks. They targeted Afghan security forces and civilians. The Afghan government, weakened by corruption and infighting, struggled to maintain control. The situation in Afghanistan deteriorated rapidly. The stage was set for the Taliban's return to power. Section 7. The fall of Kabul, chaos and uncertainty. In August 2021, as US and NATO forces completed their withdrawal, the Taliban launched a lightning offensive across Afghanistan. The Afghan government, plagued by corruption and demoralization, collapsed within days. On August 15, 2021, Taliban fighters entered Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan. The fall of Kabul triggered scenes of chaos and panic. Thousands of Afghans, fearing Taliban reprisals, rushed to Kabul's airport. They desperately tried to flee the country. The images of Afghans clinging to departing US military aircraft shocked the world. They underscored the humanitarian crisis unfolding in Afghanistan. The Taliban's takeover marked the end of the 20-year war in Afghanistan. It also represented a strategic failure for the United States and its allies. The war had cost trillions of dollars. It had claimed the lives of thousands of US and NATO soldiers. It had also resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of Afghan civilians. The Taliban's return to power raised serious questions about the future of Afghanistan. It also raised questions about the legacy of the US intervention. Section 8. A humanitarian catastrophe, Afghanistan after the withdrawal. In the aftermath of the Taliban's takeover, Afghanistan plunged into a humanitarian catastrophe. The country was already facing severe challenges. These included poverty, drought, and displacement. The Taliban's return to power exacerbated these problems. They plunged the country into further chaos and uncertainty. The Taliban's takeover triggered an economic collapse. The international community responded by cutting off aid. They froze Afghan assets. This sent the Afghan economy into a tailspin. Millions of Afghans were plunged into poverty. They faced hunger, disease, and displacement. The Taliban's human rights record also raised serious concerns. They imposed harsh restrictions on women and girls. They banned them from education and employment. The Taliban cracked down on dissent. They persecuted those who had collaborated with the previous government. The humanitarian situation in Afghanistan remains dire. It requires urgent international attention and assistance. Section 9. A nation adrift, Afghanistan's uncertain future. 2 years after the Taliban's takeover, Afghanistan remains a country adrift. The Taliban have consolidated their grip on power. They have imposed their strict interpretation of Islamic law. They have shown little tolerance for dissent or opposition. The future of Afghanistan remains uncertain. The Taliban face numerous challenges. These include a crippled economy, a resurgent insurgency, and international isolation. The international community remains wary of the Taliban. They are hesitant to provide recognition or assistance. The Taliban must demonstrate a genuine commitment to human rights, inclusivity, and counterterrorism. Only then can they hope to gain international legitimacy and support. The war in Afghanistan may be over. However, the country and its people continue to grapple with the consequences. The future of Afghanistan hangs in the balance. It remains to be seen whether the Taliban can govern effectively. It also remains to be seen whether they can bring peace and stability to the country after decades of conflict.